Universitas Maranatha memiliki akreditasi yang bagus dan juga fasilitas yang sangat lengkap.
Maranatha itu bagus dan ekspektasinya keren untuk berkuliah di sini.
Dan alasan saya memilih kampus ini karena menurut saya kampus ini sangat bagus dan juga sangat terkenal di Indonesia maupun di provinsi saya.
Jessica, I come from Taiwan. I very enjoy my life in here.
I'm so happy I can study here. I think Maranatha is like a home.
Learning in Maranatha is fun and interesting.
Everyone is very friendly. Studying in Maranatha is my very good experience. Thank you very much.
Jadi ilmu yang saya dapat dari Maranatha setelah lulus itu enak banget buat diterapin ke tempat kerja saya sekarang. Pokoknya saya benar-benar sangat menerapkan ilmu yang saya pelajari di kampus untuk ke dunia kerja saya sekarang terpakai banget.
Nothing is impossible, and if that you work hard and you put all your effort on it, you're going to get exactly what you wish for. And if you do what you love, then you won't have to work a day for it.
Maranatha.
How many human lives make up this world? Each with its own unique story. Dreams, love, passion, challenges, sometimes failure too. Even so, we wish a bright future for that little boy just learning to walk. And hope that little girl's innocent smile will last forever. Times may change, but the dreams that inspire us stay the same. It all started with one thermometer. 100 years of Terumo's history. A history of challenges to brighten up each unique life. For every medical professional, healthcare begins with a precious warmth. The precious smiles of a caring family. A precious tomorrow waiting for you. We have an abiding passion for healthcare and human life. A passion that will only get stronger into the next 100 years. Believing in a step forward into a better future for medicine. Stride ahead. We are Terumo.
Salam relawan kemanusiaan. Apakah kalian tahu tentang donor plasma konvalesen? Plasma konvalesen adalah cairan darah yang mengandung antibodi COVID-19 berasal dari pasien yang sudah dinyatakan sembuh dari penyakit COVID-19. Plasma konvalesen berguna untuk meningkatkan antibodi dan menurunkan jumlah virus antigen COVID-19 pada penderita COVID-19. Calon pendonor plasma konvalesen adalah seseorang yang terdiagnosis COVID-19 dan sudah dinyatakan sembuh, dibuktikan dengan hasil pemeriksaan swab menggunakan RT-PCR sebanyak 2 kali dan bersedia menyumbangkan plasmanya secara sukarela. Cara pengambilan plasma konvalesen menggunakan metode apresis. Metode pengambilan darah menggunakan mesin apresis. Mesin ini akan mengambil komponen darah yang kita perlukan berupa sel darah merah, trombosit atau plasma darah, dan mengembalikan komponen darah lainnya kembali kepada tubuh. Metode apresis bisa digunakan sebagai terapi. Pada masa pandemi, metode apresis digunakan untuk mengambil plasma darah donor penyintas COVID-19 yang kemudian akan diberikan kepada pasien yang sedang dalam perawatan COVID-19. Plasma darah yang diambil sebanyak 400-600 ml. Proses pengambilan plasma darah memakan waktu 60 menit. Proses pemulihan plasma darah membutuhkan waktu yang terhitung cepat, sehingga pendonor dapat mendonorkan kembali plasmanya 2 minggu setelahnya. Syarat donor plasma konvalesen. Calon pendonor mempunyai riwayat terkonfirmasi COVID-19 dengan pemeriksaan swab RT-PCR. Diutamakan calon pendonor laki-laki usia 18-60 tahun, berat badan minimal 55 kg, pasien COVID telah dinyatakan sembuh dengan 2 kali pemeriksaan swab dengan hasil RT-PCR negatif dan diutamakan dengan hasil positif antibodi COVID-19. Suhu tubuh minimal 36,5 derajat Celcius sampai 37,5 derajat Celcius. Calon pendonor bersedia menandatangani informed consent. Memenuhi persyaratan donor darah secara umum sesuai dengan Permenkes nomor 91 tahun 2015 tentang standar pelayanan transfusi darah. Calon pendonor tidak sedang menderita tekanan darah tinggi, tidak sedang menderita kencing manis atau diabetes mellitus, tidak mempunyai penyakit jantung dan pembuluh darah, tidak menderita atau pernah menderita hepatitis B atau C, sifilis, dan HIV atau AIDS. Alur donor plasma konvalesen. Calon pendonor memberikan salinan hasil pemeriksaan swab RT-PCR kepada pihak PMI. Calon pendonor akan mendapatkan penjelasan dan menandatangani informed consent. Calon pendonor membuat kesepakatan untuk jadwal pengambilan darah. Calon pendonor datang ke PMI Kota Tangerang untuk melakukan pengambilan darah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From Jakarta, Indonesia, I hope you're doing well amidst all the challenge and change during this pandemic. It's my pleasure to be your host for international webinar Convalescent Plasma Therapy. I'm Dian Eka Putri from Terumo, Indonesia. On behalf of Indonesian Medical Council, Maranatha Christian University, Terumo, Indonesia, Itama Ranoraya, and Primaya Hospital, we would like to extend very welcome to all participants from Australia, Cambodia, China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, India, Iran, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. We appreciate you take your time to join us today. I would like to welcome our panelists and moderator that have already joined with us today. Professor Michael J. Joyner, Medical Doctor from Mayo Clinic. Professor Arturo Casadevall, Medical Doctor, Master of Science, Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Professor Liise-anne Pirofski, Medical Doctor from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Teresia Monica Raharjo, Anesthesiology, Intensive Care Consultant, Master of Science, Magister Management, Magister Hospital Management from Maranatha Christian University. Dr. Ria Syafitri, Evi Gantini, Magister Biomedical from Indonesian Red Cross, and Dr. Anupam Chabra from Terumo, Indonesia. I'd like to welcome Ministry of State Secretariat for joining us for today's webinar. Before we start the presentation, I would like to explain the sequence of this webinar. First, singing the national anthem of Republik Indonesia, Indonesia Raya. Second, greeting from the Dean of Maranatha Medical Faculty. Third, welcome speech from Chancellor of Maranatha Christian University. Fourth, opening speech from Chief Indonesian Medical Council. Fifth, presentation from 5 speakers. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to present. All participants can post your question at Q&A box. The speaker will answer your question as discussion session for 20 minutes. And closing. Now, let's begin this webinar with singing the national anthem of Republik Indonesia, Indonesia Raya. Let's turn to greeting from Dean of Maranatha Medical Faculty. I'd like to welcome Dr. Diana Krisanti Jasaputra, Master of Health. The time is yours.
Yang terhormat Menteri Sekretaris Negara Republik Indonesia, Profesor Dr. Andes Praktikno, M.Si. Dear all speakers, Professor Arturo Casadevall, M.D., M.S., Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Professor Michael G. Joyner, M.D. from Mayo Clinic, Rochester. Dr. Monica, Specialist Anesthesia, K-EMD, M.Si, M.M. Mas from Maranatha Christian University. Dr. Ria Syafitri, F.I. Gantini, M.Biomed, Unit Donor Darah Pusat PMI. Professor Liise Pirofski, M.D. from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Putu, Moda, Arsana, Sp.PD, K-EMD, FINASIM, Chief of Indonesian Medical Council, Director of Maranatha Christian University, Professor Sri Widiantoro, M.Si, Ph.D., Dr. Anupam Chabra, M.D. from Terumo Blood and Cell Technologies, and all invited guests, and all participants. Welcome to Convalescent Plasma Therapy International Seminar. First of all, let us praise the Lord for His blessing. And I would like to say thank you to all speakers who are willing to share their knowledge with all participants. Also, thank you to all sponsors, Terumo, PT Itama, Ranoraya, and Primaraya Hospital who are support this event. I wish the seminar could be useful for all and accelerate in resolving COVID-19 pandemic. Through this seminar, convalescent plasma therapy is expected to continue as a treatment for COVID-19 patients and several other diseases. So stay healthy, and God bless all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diana, for very warm greeting. Now let's move on to welcome speech from Chancellor of Maranatha Christian University, Professor Sri Widiantoro, Master of Science, Ph.D. Time is yours. Prof. Widiantoro, Prof. Sri, could you please unmute your speaker? Thank you, Prof.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending this seminar. I would like to extend a special warm welcome to the Minister of State Secretariat of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Pratikno. Thank you very much indeed for participating in this webinar. It's a great honor to have you with us this evening. I would like to thank Dr. Putu Moda Arsana, the Chief of Indonesian Medical Council, will be giving an opening speech. And a very good morning to you all, our very renowned and prominent professors from USA. We are very pleased to have Professor Arturo Casadevall from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, a very prestigious institution, of course. Also Professor Michael J. Joyner from the Mayo Clinic, and Professor Liise-anne Pirofski from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Thank you very much for your willingness to share your expertise and experience, especially related to convalescent plasma therapy through this webinar. I would also like to thank our speakers, Dr. Syafitri, Gantini, the head of Central Blood Transfusion Unit from the Indonesian Red Cross. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Monica from our university, Maranatha Christian University, for her many initiatives. It's a great honor as well as a great pleasure to have you each with us today to give a talk on a very important topic, convalescent plasma therapy. I believe that you are all the right experts to deliver this talk, as you have made an indispensable contribution towards the understanding of convalescent plasma therapy. Again, thank you very much indeed for your kindness and willingness to enlighten us on this very important subject. To all the participants, also thank you for your presence in this Zoom meeting. Thank you for staying late tonight to listen to this important webinar. So, without further ado, I would like to invite the speakers to give their talks. Have a wonderful seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Widiantoro, for the welcome speech. We will go ahead and take some time to hear opening speech from Chief Indonesian Medical Council, Dr. Putu Moda Arsana, Internal Medicine, Endocrine, Metabolic Diabetic Consultant, Fellow of the Indonesian Society of Internal Medicine. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dian. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you are all in a good health. Before I start, I would like to say many thanks to the Maranatha medical faculty for inviting me to join this great meeting about plasma convalescent therapy. On behalf of Indonesian Medical Council, we also thank to all of the speakers and all of the attendees from Indonesia and from abroad, especially for Professor Joyner from Mayo Clinic, Professor Casadevall from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Professor N. Pirofski from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Dr. Gantini from Indonesian Red Cross Institution, Dr. Monica from Maranatha Christian University, and also Dr. Anupam from Thermo Company. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know, until now, there are some modalities in treatment of COVID-19, including plasma convalescent. In the past, plasma convalescent therapy was successful in the treatment of systemic acute respiratory syndrome, Middle East respiratory syndrome, avian influenza, and Ebola. But the result in the treatment of SARS-CoV-2 virus still questionable. This question arises because of there are many controversies have been reported, including meta-analysis. So our question is, where is the controversies come from? If we perform critical appraisal to all of the publication, the controversies might be come from, first, from the study method. The study method that including in meta-analysis varies from case study to clinical trial. And clinical trial also varies as well. Second is donors. Antibody level from donors that used in many studies also varies from 1/80 to 1/320. Third is the state of clinical, the clinical staging of disease. The clinical staging of disease that reported varies from moderate to critically ill patients. The fourth is the timing. Plasma convalescent transfusion. The timing of transfusion also varies from the patient with early course of disease to late course of disease. And the fifth is the frequency of transfusion. Most of studies just gave plasma convalescent twice, even though we know that antibody work as a neutralizing agent for virus and logically should be given many times as long as virus is still in the body. The sixth, also about the amount of plasma convalescent that needed for patients, because we know that the body weight of the patient varies from one to another. So until now, there is still many gray area that should be described, and many questions must be answered. And of course, we hope that this meeting could give us some conclusion whether plasma convalescent therapy effective or ineffective against SARS-CoV-2 virus. Finally, happy discussion for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Putu, for the opening speech. We will go ahead and take some time to continue, the next session is presentation. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the capacity of health system to continue the delivery essential health services. The objective of today's webinar is to learn from the renowned faculty about the research, current trends, and guidelines on convalescent plasma therapy in SARS-CoV-2 patients. We are honored today to have 5 eminent speakers from the USA and Indonesia. We will move on to panel presentation, and please allow me to read his CV. Dr. Anupam Chabra, Senior Medical Advisor, Terumo Blood and Cell Technology, will moderate this session today. He has experience as head of the Department Transfusion Medicine at Puspanjali Crossley Hospital. He has several publications and poster presentations related with blood transfusion science and medicine. I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. Anupam. Please, Dr. Anupam.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to today's session. Can I have the slide for the Professor Arturo Casadevall, please? Yeah, so it's a great honor and a pleasure to invite Professor Arturo Casadevall. He's an M.D. medicine from New York University and postdoctoral fellowship in cell biology from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He's certified American Board in Internal Medicine and also subspecialty of infectious disease from American Board in Internal Medicine as well. He's currently working as Alfred and Jill Summer Professor and Chair at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Department of Molecular Biology and Immunology. He's also visiting professor of medicine, microbiology and immunology at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He has enormous number of publications in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters and monographs to his credit. May I please invite Professor Arturo to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I project the slides? Do I share the screen and project the slides, or do you have them?
Diane, can you help the professor to upload the slides, please?
No, those are not mine. I suspect that's Dr. Pirofski. I have them. So I have them. I will present them. My talk will deal with convalescent plasma for COVID-19, and I will talk about the past to introduce the topic, the present, and the future. I think everyone here knows what convalescent plasma is, but just as a reminder, it is the liquid part of the blood, and in particular, it's obtained by apheresis, as everyone knows. The one important point is that it is 90% water, 10% protein, 1% antibody, and a very small part of that is the specific antibody. And it is the only therapy that is obtained directly from another human being. And part of the problem with plasma is that it's variable, that every unit is different. This therapy dates to the late 19th century, and it resulted in the first Nobel Prize that was given to Adolf von Behring for the treatment of diphtheria. So we are talking about something that is very old and for which we have a lot of experience in use. The antibody therapies were used primarily in the beginning of the 20th century. It was used against many types of infectious diseases, but it was largely abandoned in the 1930s with the advent of antimicrobial therapy. Since then, antibodies have retained a niche in infectious diseases, but by and large are not as used as often and as much as they could be. Convalescent plasma was used in prior epidemics. For example, it was used in the 1918 epidemic, and then it was used for many times as outbreaks because it is available as soon as you have people who recovered. So it doesn't need development. It can be very rapidly deployed. Analysis of the 1918 epidemic that was published early this century by Dr. Tom Luke suggested that it was effective. With the use of convalescent, they used serum. They didn't use plasma because they didn't have apheresis machines. They used to take the blood, spin it down, and give the serum. Had a reduced mortality by about 20%. However, antibody therapies were abandoned in infectious disease in the mid-20th century. The reason for this, for bacterial diseases, was the availability of antimicrobial agents. For viral diseases, it was the discovery of serum hepatitis, which was now we know is caused by hepatitis B and C. Today, one can screen the blood from this, so the likelihood of any hepatitis after plasma is extremely low. One of the things that is very, very frustrating during this pandemic is that the use of these therapies really has not been done with the knowledge of history. And in fact, many of these were deployed without taking into account what was known. And I will just read you the first line of an article from 1937. It is a fundamental principle in all serum therapy that to obtain the best results, the serum must be given early in disease. This statement holds true regardless of whether one is using antitoxic or antibacterial serum. So three of us actually wrote a paper recently laying out the principles. These were known in the past, never written down. The specificity principle states that the plasma must have antibody. It turns out that some clinical trials have been done without insufficient amounts without no antibody. The quantitative principle, you must have enough antibody. And the temporal principle is that antibody preparations are most effective when given early in the course of disease. This is data from 107 years ago down here, showing mortality on meningococcal meningitis. You can see that the mortality doubles between whether you give it in the first 3 days or you give it the 7th day. Efficacy in prior epidemics has been variable. For example, in the influenza was about 20%. In some of them, in particularly, they have been much higher. For June virus, one of the best done studies from Argentina showed a 93% reduction in mortality. However, for some diseases, like Ebola virus and seasonal flu, the results were not as good. For Ebola virus, they got an 18% reduction in mortality in West Africa, but once they adjusted for the confounders, it was reduced to 8%. Now, for SARS-CoV-2, we still don't know, but let's just say that a meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done, excluding recovery, showed about a 35% reduction in mortality. So if you look at those two negative trials, you can begin to identify problems. In the case of the West Africa use, there was a problem with the quantitative principle. They used plasma with unknown amounts of specific antibody, and subsequent studies show that many potential donors in the area had no significant antibody. If a recent study here in the United States for influenza A had problems with both the temporal and the quantitative principle. 44% of the patients were in the ICU with advanced disease. Antibody is not going to reverse inflammation. Antibody generally works as an antiviral, so it is unlikely to work on patients that are in the intensive care unit. And there was also a problem with the quantitative principle, since their high titer was only about greater than 1 to 80, and based on the experience with COVID-19, one needs to use more. In the United States, more than 500,000 patients have been treated with plasma since March of last year, and it remains under what is known as emergency use authorization by the FDA, which means that physicians can use it. If you look at the use of plasma in the United States, it follows the epidemic. As cases have gone up, more has been used. Is it working? This is what everybody wants to know. And I will take you through 7 lines of evidence. But the first is mechanism of action. The answer will be yes. Animal studies, yes. The emergency access program from the Mayo Clinic, Michael Joyner will cover it. About 10 observational studies. The answer is yes. 10 randomized controlled trials. Here is where the data are mixed. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. Liise-anne Pirofski will cover this. There are the experiments of nature. Will also be covered by Dr. Joyner, and I will mention to you population data from the United States. So the mechanism of action. Plasma contains many types of antibodies. The generally accepted mechanism of action is that these antibodies are neutralizing, or they antiviral. And this has been shown by many studies that the administration of plasma reduces virus in recipients. Convalescent plasma, however, is highly heterogeneous product. Every unit is different. And it varies in both antibody amount, it varies in the type of antibodies that are found. Some of them have IgM, IgA, and also the activity of plasma varies from unit to unit. There are at least 4 antiviral activities. It is neutralizing, it mediates phagocytosis of viral particles, it activates complement, and it also mediates the phenomenon of antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, which is very important against viral diseases. Animal studies have shown that convalescent plasma is effective against SARS-CoV-2 in animal models, including non-human primates. And in fact, there was another recent study. In the case of COVID, we're doing things differently. Usually you do animal studies first and then do humans. In this case, it's being used in humans with the animal data following afterwards. The observational studies with propensity controls, most of them show large decreases in mortality if plasma is used early. I'm showing you 2 examples here. One is from Mount Sinai in New York City, and the other one is from Methodist, Texas, in Houston. And the Methodist, Texas study revealed a large decrease in mortality. But notice when you use it within 3 days, you see the effect. You don't see it after 3 days. And they were able to look at their data, and they identified a critical window of about 44 hours during admission. So if you used it before that, it was more likely to work. Now, remember, patients have been admitted to the hospital. Some of them have been sick for many days. Others have been sick for only a few days. So this is likely to be a statistical distribution. But the bottom line is, the earlier you use it, the more likely it is to be useful. Randomized controlled trial has been mixed, and Dr. Pirofski will cover this. In the United States, the usage per admission peaked in October and has steadily declined. This is something that has followed the negative randomized controlled trials. So what you see there are 3 negative randomized controlled trials. There was the trial from India, the trial from Argentina, and finally, the recovery. And you see that physicians are reacting to the information, and many of them have not been using it. So in response to uncertainty, the frontline physicians have continued to use convalescent plasma, but the use has been significantly reduced. The country responses are highly variable, with some allowing its use and others limiting to randomized controlled trials. There has been little guidance from guideline committees, which generally consider only randomized controlled trial recommendations, but in this case, it's been mixed. Local hospital guidelines predominate with variable use patterns. So we have coined the term plasma hesitancy in the sense that many physicians have pulled away from using it, weighing the negative data more than the positive data. And what I'm about to show you is that this has had major negative consequences in the United States. We were able to document, this is a population level analysis. This is all the plasma that was used in the United States with mortality. So if you look at mortality per admissions, it is inversely correlated with plasma doses per admission. This is a preprint that is available. You can download it and read it. So the more plasma the United States used, the lower mortality it had. We were able to calculate that since that in the last 4 months of the 2021, as many as 30,000 excess deaths may have resulted from plasma hesitancy. We are working very hard to educate and to get this information out to people because we think that plasma is a relatively safe therapy. There are not a lot of alternatives. And certainly this data suggests that people may be dying from the lack of use. So the situation today is that convalescent plasma is available through the entire United States. It is the Food and Drug Administration continues to support it. The emergence of variants highlights the challenges to vaccine and new possibilities for plasma. Plasma needs no development. All you need is somebody who recovers. So if if the variants become a problem, people who recover from the variants can have plasma that can neutralize them. Convalescent plasma, one of these consequences of this major effort, a good one, is that it cleared the way for monoclonals and vaccines. Early in the pandemic, there was great concern about the possibility of antibody-dependent enhancement. None of that happens. Had there been any antibody-dependent enhancement, the vaccines and the monoclonals would have been delayed significantly. There are numerous randomized clinical trials underway. More certainty on efficacy can be expected over the next few months. And finally, physicians and patients need to be aware that the efficacy of plasma is dependent on titer and amount and timing. So physicians need to give it early and patients should seek early care. And I believe that's my last slide. So I will stop sharing. And I return. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Casadevall. Great talk. Thanks a lot. And without further ado, I will move on to the second speaker for today, Professor Michael J. Joyner. Professor Joyner is M.D. Medicine from University of Arizona and Professor of Anesthesiology at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. He's an American certified American Board of Anesthesiology and currently working as Vice Chair for Research, Development of Anesthesiology and Perioperative Medicine at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. He has enormous publications and chapters in the books, and we have been reading his publications as well on convalescent plasma. May I kindly invite Professor Michael Joyner to please deliver his talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me just share my screen here and we will get started. So what I want to do in today's talk is really follow up on what Dr. Casadevall did and try to imagine what would happen if convalescent plasma was a normal therapeutic product that had been developed over a normal timeline, 16 years instead of 6 months or 6 weeks or 16 months in rapid deployment during the pandemic. So let's just think about what happened as we review the last year and a half. There was limited treatment options in early 2020 as the virus emerged. The use of convalescent plasma, as Arturo pointed out, is always going to be the first reasonable biological shot on goal. There's plenty of historical precedents. Other than scale up, there's very limited barriers to its use. And it's really been drug discovery done backwards as we deployed the product and then have started to backfill some of the data that would normally happen really in the other direction if this was drug development. So there's lots of controversy. Does it work? There's been concerns about so-called pandemic exceptionalism, political issues, especially in the United States, associated with its use, and really cognitive challenges, in my opinion, to guideline makers who really favor randomized controlled trials, which are wonderful if you're looking at lipid-lowering drugs and heart disease, but perhaps are more challenging in a fast-moving infectious disease that kills people quickly, where the knowledge base is less secure. So these are the IDSA guidelines, American Infectious Disease Society of American guidelines. And if you just look what they said here, convalescent plasma suggests against use, recommended only in the context of a clinical trial, knowledge gap. You look at time for a reassessment. You look at the boom is over from the New York Times. So as things wax and wane and one study or the next comes in, opinions seem to change with the phases of the moon. So there's been a lot of different ideas about this and periods of enthusiasm, periods of hesitancy, and so forth. But let's play imaginary drug development here. Reassemble the pieces of the convalescent plasma evidence puzzle, imagining a normal time frame and sequence of drug development events. Show you that in 16 months, all key pieces of the normal 16-year drug development puzzle are in place, and then ask you to reassess the efficacy of CP. Now, I know a lot of people on this call or on the Zoom have some enthusiasm for convalescent plasma, but not everybody we visit with shares that enthusiasm. So this is the typical drug development steps and timelines. And you can see 3 to 6 years for basic research. Then we have a 1 to 6 year valley of death. Then perhaps 5 or 10 more years, 1 or 2 more years, and so forth. So in the US, it's 12 to 16 years and $1 to $2 billion, which is a lot of time and a lot of money. And let's not forget also real world data, real world evidence down the road after the drug is or is not approved. So now let's break this down. We have a new need. What's our general strategy? What's our target? What do the basic studies say? What do the animal studies say? What do the human studies say? And what does the real world data and the real world evidence say? So new need, general strategy. We've got this brand new infectious disease. We know that antibodies have been used in the past for treatment and prophylaxis. We know that antivirals exist for treatment. We know that there are vaccines for prevention. So there's a lot of different things you can do if you have a new virus out there. But what can you do first? And that's antibodies. And that's what we're going to focus on again with our imaginary drug development story. Now, again, notable historic uses of antibody therapy. You can see by 1900, it was in widespread use for a variety of diseases, and you can see it went through. There was a lack or less interest here, but it has a bit of a revival more recently, and obviously a big revival during the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic. Dr. Casadevall showed this. This is a classic meta-analysis from Luke related to the 1918 flu pandemic. And the key finding here is that people who were treated, 54 out of 336 died, or 16%, 452 out of 1219, or 37% tried. Now, these trials and experiments and reports were done differently in 1918. But if you actually go back and read many of them, they're pretty impressive considering it was more than 100 years ago. Now, the next steps, we have this rationale now. We're gonna try antibodies. We're going to try antibodies derived from humans to try to treat this novel threat. So now we would go on and say, let's look at basic and animal studies. and see where we are right in here. Let's see if we can get past the validated death into translational research. Well, antibodies neutralize the virus in vitro. There are many, many examples of this, and they do it several different ways, as Dr. Casadevall works. So we at least have some idea that these antibodies work in a test tube. Now we move on to animal models. We can use the hamster animal model. There's been some engineered mice that have recently emerged. There are non-human primate data and so forth. But moreover, passive transfer of convalescent serum to naive hamsters efficiently suppressed the replication of the virus in the lungs, even when the serum was administered 2 days post-infection of the serum-treated hamsters. So again, this is not prophylactic use, this is therapeutic use. So it works here. And then imagine that there's an imaginary tech transfer office at your institution, and they've been able to generate commercial interest and funding. So what would you do next? Well, I think you'd try to move to human trials, and this is our good friends from Star Trek, and we do human trials full ahead. So now we've moved to this part of the ecosystem, which is what we're going to do with clinical development, clinical trials. Well, the first thing we need to do is, again, remember the principles of antibody therapy that we heard about earlier. And again, it is a fundamental principle in all serum therapy that to obtain the best results, the serum must be given early in the disease. This statement holds true regardless of whether one is using antitoxic or antibacterial serum. And it's really important to note that Russell Cecil is the person responsible for Cecil's textbook of medicine. And he's one of the absolute giants of American medicine and medical education, and that he was willing to make this statement so definitively in 1937 is of great interest. And that just shows you where the common knowledge was before so much was forgotten about antibody therapy. So now we're going to do imaginary, phase 0 or phase 1 studies, and we have to do pharmacokinetics and so forth. But imagine this. Imagine some of these studies were done, and we look at viral clearance. Does the drug actually do what it does in the test tube, or does in the animals, and clear the virus from people? Well, if you look at this meta-analysis from all sorts of studies out there, including RCTs only in this meta-analysis, convalescent plasma has been shown literally in every study to reduce viral load or enhance viral clearance. That is incredibly true. It doesn't matter whether the drug is given early, late, or whenever you get viral clearance. So I think we have a positive sign. We would next ask the regulator saying we've got evidence that it works in vitro, evidence it works in animals, and evidence that it causes viral clearance. Can we go ahead with human trials? Well, we would think about early treatment, because we know what Professor Cecil said, and this is the data from Argentina, which was really an outpatient study. It's by Lipster and colleagues, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And you can see proportion free of severe respiratory disease. This is convalescent plasma versus placebo. These were older subjects, and these were subjects at very high risk of hospitalization and subsequent death. And again, you can see that things were much better with convalescent plasma, and there was a mortality benefit in this cohort or in the study, and that mortality benefit was higher in the people who got the highest titer plasma. So very, very consistent with the principles of antibody therapy and what would be described as an early study if we were doing traditional drug development, and that is early treatment was one of the principles covered. Specificity is another principle, and in this case, the people that got higher titer plasma did better. So we're looking really, really pretty good so far. Now, maybe we would also think about special uses. We might look at patients who are deficient, patients who can't make antibodies, and these could come in one of two ways. They could come from people with diseases like hematologic malignancies, leukemias, lymphomas, and so forth, whose bone marrow has been suppressed and may not have enough T cells and B cells to make antibodies. It could also come from people with various hereditary issues with their immune response. So we looked at some patients with heme malignancies. There's a large registry, and luckily some of these patients were treated with convalescent plasma. So if you look at all comers, convalescent plasma treated heme malignancy patients died at a much lower rate from SARS-CoV-2 than the patients not treated with convalescent plasma. If you did the propensity matching, you get the same story. there's been rapid improvement reported in many of these patients, especially the patients who have deficient antibody responses based on things like X-linked agammaglobulinemia, and low mortality has been reported in these patients who've been treated with convalescent plasma. So now we've got an early use case, we've got nice pharmacokinetics and demonstrations of viral clearance. We've got these specialty patients who don't make antibodies or have deficient antibody responses, and things are looking pretty good. Now, if this was pancreatic cancer or some incredibly difficult disease to treat, and we stopped right here, the bells would ring, standards of care would change, stock prices would surge, and the people who discovered this wonderful therapy would be thinking about their Nobel Prize and getting plane reservations for Stockholm. But things didn't stop there, and things have moved on. So we looked at a meta-analysis of all human studies, and again, these are the matched control. These are the randomized control trials, 0.65. These are the matched control studies, 0.57. And overall random effects model for everything is about 0.58. So again, a 35-40% reduction in mortality when you look at the convalescent plasma data as a whole. That those numbers are higher when you look at people treated earlier and when you look at people treated with higher titer plasma. Now, then comes something like the recovery trial, which is a huge trial in the United Kingdom. Hospitalized patients treated late in disease. Now, the nice thing about this trial is, one, it showed that there was efficacy, and Dr. Pirofski will perhaps go over this and other trials more later. And also, there were subgroups of this, patients treated early in disease, and they actually did pretty well. You can see something looking like a mortality benefit. People treated less than 7 days since the onset of symptoms, people who did not receive oxygen, people not receiving corticosteroids, a marked reduction here, and negative antibody test results. While these people died at a pretty high rate, the people who were not generating antibodies for whatever reasons, it did appear as if convalescent plasma worked. And that's one of the things I think it's important to recognize, is that in all of the major negative randomized controlled trials, there are these signals of efficacy if you dig deeper into the data. And that can either be in the early treated subgroups, it can be related to symptom resolution, it can be related to an early survival benefit, or some evidence of a dose response curve in that people who got higher titer plasma did better. So while the trials themselves may be negative due to late treatment or other issues, there are signals of efficacy in these trials when you drill down and apply the principles of antibody therapy in your reading of the papers. Dr. Casadevall showed this. There's also real-world data supporting what the efficacy story. This is the plasma dose per admission versus mortality over time in the U.S. This is when you break it down into percent of admissions receiving convalescent plasma into quintiles. And you can see if only about 20% of patients receive convalescent plasma during a given week, you have a mortality of around 22%. And if 40 to 50% receive it, you have a mortality of around 18%. So a nice drop in mortality, especially when you consider how little we have to offer hospitalized patients with this terrible disease. Now, what if we did it the normal way? Again, it would have taken 12 to 16 years. But we didn't do it the normal way. We did it a faster way, and the FDA authorized, or at least gave the United States emergency use authorization based on this data. And this data, the emergency use authorization is based on early use, immunocompromised patients, and that was revised in February this year. So we started off really in the United States giving doses to anybody, and I call it guesstimate doses of an uncharacterized subject to all-comer patients. We now have much better characterized plasma. We're focusing on early use, and we're focusing on immune-compromised patients. As we await more data to emerge, there are some trials out there that I think will probably show at least some signals of benefit early in disease. And I can tell you that there's a very large real-world data set in tens of thousands of patients, which appears to confirm both early use and the utility of high titer plasma in treating patients with SARS-CoV-2. So now imagine, a pandemic like we just had emerges with a closely related virus. So we've just showed you how the imaginary SARS virus was what was with antibody therapy or plasma therapy was, imagined, validated, and then tested in humans over 16 imaginary years. So let's just say it's approved for something very similar. Collection and distribution of CP can be scaled. Is it safe at scale? We know it's safe at scale now. Can it be used later in disease? Probably not. Antiviral development is lagged. All we have is remdesivir, and while that may reduce hospital stay or may help people get better faster, the effects on mortality are highly questionable. And vaccine development, we know, will take time. And so what I would just simply say is that under these circumstances, with the knowledge we have and the fact we've backfilled things, we have pretty good evidence that CP works, and its use has been very reasonable, and we've learned as we've gone. And this reminds me of what Peter Medawar, the Nobel Prize winner, said. He raised questions about inductive reasoning and scientific thought, and he wrote this classic paper called Is a Scientific Paper Fraudulent? Because what Professor Medawar said is we all tell these stories about how we have a hypothesis and march through a chain of reasoning till we get an answer to our question. And he said in reality, things work in a much more chaotic way, and that these narratives of translation are really pieced together post hoc. And I think if we do what Professor Medawar suggested was in fact happening and pieced the evidence puzzle together post hoc for convalescent plasma, it looks pretty good, especially early in disease and especially in patients who cannot make endogenous antibodies. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Joyner. It was a very lucid talk. Thanks a lot. And let's move on to the next speaker. Next speaker for the evening is Dr. Teresia Monica Raharjo. She needs no introduction to the Indonesian audience, but my duty to introduce her. She's an MD from Maranatha Christian University and also an M.Si from Institute Technology Bandung. She is an intensive care consultant and a Master of Management and Master of Hospital Management as well. She is a lecturer in Faculty of Medicine at Maranatha Christian University and Head of Anesthesia Installation at Maxillofacial Hospital, Maranatha. She is also the Chief of Development Innovation Collaboration Center, Faculty of Medicine, Maranatha Christian University. May I request Dr. Monica to please deliver her talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anupam. Let's start. For the first slide. Okay. I would like to present how to apply convalescent plasma therapy effectively. Why convalescent plasma? It is our big dream that we have ideal treatment for COVID-19 patients, like oral antiviral drug. But what we have now? There is no specific oral antiviral drug. So we must find another alternative modality of treatment for COVID-19 that is specific, that is causal, that is affordable, with many sources, and safe. And convalescent plasma fits all these parameters. The basic of convalescent plasma is antibody contained in the plasma has a function to eliminate the virus, not to repair damaged organ. This is the most important thing. Antibody contained in the plasma to eliminate the virus. Just keep in mind about it. Now, what do we have? Yes, we have convalescent plasma. We have guidelines. We have study results. We have resources. We also have drugs and support therapy. And of course, we have the virus. We already know about the donor and recipient criteria. We use this recipient criteria
confirm positive PCR test result, and moderate, severe, and critical state of the disease. So, in conclusion, recipient in every condition can have convalescent plasma therapy. And what's the real problem here? The first problem is study design. There is many studies around the world with variable result. Some of them support convalescent plasma, some of them not supported. Second problem, the criteria of donor and recipient. Third, the coordination, collaboration, and funding. And of course, we still have the sexy virus. So, what can we do to solve the problem? And what are the magic words? Dose, antibody level, and application time. Why? Let's take a look. 1. It is a dose. 1 bag, 3 to 5 cc per kilo's body weight, and been given 1 to 4 hours. Subsequent dose can be repeated within 48 hours, depend on patient clinical condition. But until now, we haven't found that equality or conversion, how many virus can be eradicated with 1 bag of plasma. We still have no idea about that. How many? It depends on disease severity. Here, in our experience, moderate state of the disease usually use 2 bags of plasma. Severe state of the disease usually use 3 to 4 bags of plasma. And more than 5 to 6 bags of plasma can be used to treat critical state of the disease. It's not efficient at all. We have to give the plasma earlier in moderate or even earlier in mild diseases. Well, based on the one study in China, there is a patient treated with 8 times of convalescent plasma treatment, and it averaged more than 2,000 cc of plasma. Well, maybe he or she will recover, but that's a huge amount of plasma. If we use it early, it can increase its efficiency and we can treat more people. Why we use early? Why we use a higher antibody level? Because we have to compare to viral load. Higher viral load need more antibody. This is the immunity level. And based on the data that we have, that the mild or moderate patient tend to have higher antibody against COVID-19. 2. Antibody level. The ideal antibody level is 1,320. But minimal antibody level that we use is 1,160. One of the study, I really like this article and this study. That is a patient dose response study that showed that the higher titer of convalescent plasma can lower the mortality rate than the lower titer of convalescent plasma. 3. When we can give the convalescent plasma. Generally, we can give it in the first 14 days since symptoms occur, not since the first day in the hospital, because we didn't know how many days the patient already suffered for COVID-19 in home. Well, we can say, oh, in those articles, it say that below the 7 days, we already give a plasma, but the study didn't pay attention regardless how many days the patient already suffer for the disease in the home. If the patient already suffered 10 days or more than 10 days, and we give in the 7 days when he or she in the hospital is more than 14 days. So the effectivity will lower. Why it's first 14 days? Because it is based on viral load. As we can see in the picture or in this image, for mild disease, the viral load is higher in the first 14 days and become lower after the 40 days. But how about the severe one? The viral load still high, more than 40 days. So, where can we have the convalescent plasma treatment? It's on the stage 1 or stage 2 of the disease. As we can see, it is before the host inflammatory response phase or cytokine storm. The plasma will give the best of its all takes. And when the best time for Sp.PD? As we can see in this image or in this picture, as general, the first 14 days since the first symptoms occur. So it is after the 40 days, it's already occur sepsis, organ damage, and another damage of an inflammatory response syndrome or cytokine storm. So the best time to give the Sp.PD is the first 72 hours since dyspnea occur or first week since fever occur. In summary, it is the 9th first day. So the follow-up, how about the follow-up? Okay, we give the convalescent plasma earlier. And so how can we follow up the effectivity of the plasma? Well, we can do clinical laboratory and CT value. Why CT value? Just remember in the first slide, the antibody contained in the plasma has a function to eliminate the virus. So the seroconversion, the conversion from positive to negative can use to detect the effectivity of the convalescent plasma therapy. One study said that the group with convalescent plasma therapy has a conversion rate in 72 hours, it means 3 days, more than 80% compared to the group without convalescent plasma therapy that only 30-something%. So it is significant. And in this article, the study participant average age is around 70 years. So imagine if that senior or 70 years patient can give the negative conversion in 72 days. What will be happen if we can give early in younger patient? Now, more supporting article meta-analysis. In this article, the convalescent plasma can reduce the mortality significantly. And this meta-analysis also said that the convalescent plasma can lower the mortality rate. Well, someone asked me, Dr. Moni, what will happen if we combine the factor yields, three factors before dose, antibody level, and timing in a study? Well, combine all of the factor yields better study result. One of the example is this study, early high titer plasma therapy to prevent severe COVID-19 in older adult. Older adult, early, higher antibody. So, this study combined all of those factors. And to what extent did the combination of those antibody level and application time affect the result? Well, we can see in this trial, this last trial recovery with a huge number of participants, that regardless of those three factors, still show that CP is more effective when given early, regardless of how long symptoms have occurred. Even this study didn't combine all those three factors. So keep in mind, this is a big no-no. Wait until the patient in critical condition so we can give the plasma. No, give it early. Sp.PD is the only treatment. No. If the patient needs other treatment, just give it the other treatment. Sp.PD can be combined with other treatment. Hypercoagulation or cytokine storm, you must treat those conditions also. Sp.PD can be given even the PCR swab negative. Just remember the antibody to eliminate the virus. If the PCR swab negative, what for? Enough with 1 or 2 bags of plasma in every state of the disease. No. Every state of the disease is different. Every state of the disease has its own problem, own abnormality, own process. So there is different and cannot be compared. Cannot be compared. Okay, I give it the convalescent plasma only 2 bags in moderate disease, and I also give the plasma only 2 bags in severe disease. And I will compare the mortality rate or compare the patient between the state of the disease. The right study design is you give the plasma in the moderate disease and you didn't give the plasma in the moderate disease and you compare them. You give the plasma in severe disease, you didn't give the plasma in severe group of the disease and you compare them. And Sp.PD cannot be repeated more than 2 bags. Okay, based on efficiency, I didn't suggest you to give more than 2 bags because it's efficiency. But in more severe disease, you can give more than 2 bags. So, many others ask me, Dr. Monique, how can we treat it right? Okay. First, you can give convalescent plasma with the right dose, the right antibody level, the right application time. Second, you do the organ support. Third, you treat the hypercoagulation or the cytokine storm when it is occur. So, the combination of those factors will give the real recovery. How about Sp.PD in Indonesia? Well, we have Sp.PD book, we have research, we have also the Sp.PD that was given to patient by autonomy way. Many people ask me, Dr. Monique, why you don't mention about multi-center trial in Indonesia? Is that trial exist or not? Yes, it is. But still ongoing. This is multi-center trial is from 10 hospitals in Indonesia. In interim analysis, CPT significantly decreased mortality rate in moderate and severe state of the disease. And the clinical trial of therapeutic plasma convalescent in COVID-19 patient in Saiful Anwar General Hospital, thanks to Dr. Putu, to allow this data to publish. This still going also, and show that the convalescent plasma can lower the mortality rate. Okay, this already answered the question from many person that asked me is, do we have the multi-center trial? Yes, we have, and this is the result. And another collaboration and study. Maranatha Christian University and Primaya Hospital collaboration in CPT research. The first article is about a case series. We compare the patient that accept 1 bag of plasma with 2 bags of plasma. Patient with 2 bags of plasma have a shorter recovery period. And we continue to the second study, including 30 patients. And total patients receiving CPT from April to December 2020 are 54 patients is Primaya Hospital. And from January to April 2021 are 69 patients. From the first period, 96% of 54 patients recover. There is one complication is very mild in one patient. Patients with 2 bags of CP have shorter recovery time than patients with 1 bag of CP. And from Mayapada Hospital, Jakarta, this came from the permission of Dr. Sinta. She is a very good friend of mine. CPT also given to the patient in the ICU. The study is still ongoing, but from the available data of 33 patients, CPT group has a lower mortality, 7 patients, the non-CPT group, 30 patients. As an additional data, the mortality in CPT group mainly caused by the late treatment. And from Mandara Hospital, Bali, show that the patient were treated by CPT in the first 14 days have a lower mortality than the patient treated more than 14 days. So, what the take-home message? It's time for us to build the right study design. We already have many data. We already have many studies. So we have to make the right study design. But how? Of course, we use the right time, the right dose, the right antibody level. Of course, we use the stage of the disease. Of course, we use the result parameter. So the combination of all of them can give the right study design and at least can give the right result. So, study nature, love nature, stay close to nature, it will never fail you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. Let's move on to the next speaker for the talk. And the next speaker is Dr. Syafitri A.V. Gantini. She has a bachelor degree of medicine from University of Gajah Mada, Indonesia, and a postgraduate in biomedical program in immunology from University of Indonesia. She has a doctoral degree as well. She is right now the current working head of Central Blood Transfusion Services in Indonesian Red Cross, and also has teaching experience and working as a lecturer of Indonesia RC.P.D program and also blood transfusion service doctor's trainer. She is a technical expert and also member of Central Transfusion Medicine Society as well. She will also be joined in later part of her talk by Dr. Nova, who is a subordinate of her. So may I invite Dr. Ria to please deliver her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anupam Chabra, for your kind introduction. Greeting to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to speak about Indonesian experience in collecting and distributing convalescent plasma. Next slide, please. And the outline of this presentation to give the information about Indonesian Red Cross strategy and collecting and distributing convalescent plasma, and also to give information about how Indonesian Red Cross do the convalescent plasma recruitment and campaign. Next slide, please. And for introduction in this slide, I just want to say that in Indonesia, we already have a set of blood transfusion policy, either from the government or from the Indonesian Red Cross. And in the Constitution of Health, Indonesian Red Cross, Palang Merah Indonesia or PMI, has been delegated to do the blood services in Indonesia, that we call it PMI Blood Donor Unit or Unit Donor Darah or UDD. And how about the blood services by PMI? Next slide, please. In 2019, Indonesian Red Cross has 225 blood center or UDD of that collects 3.5 million of blood bag and made into 4.8 million bags of whole blood and component, and fulfilled around 85 to 90% of national needs of transfusion. And from 225 PMI UDD, those consist of one PMI Central Blood Transfusion Services, is my office, and 224 UDD that serve locally in many provinces and regency of city area. And from 225 PMI UDD, 17 PMI UDD were GMP certified, and also in the era of COVID-19 pandemic, we have 42 PMI UDD provided convalescent plasma. And the other, in order to increase the quality blood services in Indonesia, PMI has applied blood regional network system because Indonesia is very wide and big. So we divide to be 5 region and 30 sub-region network to consolidate some services like TTI and AT screening, blood or blood component quality control, antibody screening, blood processing, training, and other services. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, this network also works for convalescent plasma collection and coverage. And also we also applied an integrated blood donor system information management. We call it SIM-Dondar, that has been used by 114 PMI UDD. And we have a website link that we call it IO Donor, that works as a blood donor registry. Next slide, please. And here the regional PMI coverage area, we divide to be 5 region. You can see we already divide in the different color. The first region cover the Sumatra Island, Banten Province, and Jakarta Province. Second region cover the west of Java and also Kalimantan Island. The third region cover Central Java and also Yogyakarta. Fourth region consists East Java, Bali, East and West Nusa Tenggara, and the last region consists Sulawesi Island, Maluku Island, and also Papua Island. And each region has a WhatsApp group that must be reports every day the blood stock. And next slide, please. And for the increase the safe accessibility and high quality blood supply for all over Indonesia, we made a strategic plan that has 3 goals, include the safe, accessible, and quality blood in all PMI UDD. Next slide, please. Now we talk about the COVID-19
pandemic. As we know that COVID-19 pandemic was set by WHO on March 11 to 2020 due to the infection of 114 countries all over the world. In Indonesia, the first COVID-19 case was found in March 2020. Up until now, there is still no definitely therapy of COVID-19 protocol, even though there are some treatment that was proven to cure and reduce the symptom of COVID-19. And one of the additional therapy of COVID-19 is convalescent plasma that already talked with all of the speaker before. A therapy that has been used since 100 years ago by giving the plasma of the patient who has recovered. Convalescent plasma is plasma that was donated by the recovered COVID-19 patient that has COVID-19 antibody that will react or neutralize the SARS-CoV-2 antigen. Donation of convalescent plasma was one of the PMI UDD competency, of course. PME UDD can collect and process the blood into plasma. Next slide, please. And how the plasma can be obtained? Of course, we can obtain from a whole blood donation, which process into a plasma, or from plasmapheresis donation of the recovered COVID-19 patient. Next slide, please. According to the Dr. Agus from the Task Force COVID-19 in meeting 27 December, and also that FDA approved the emergency use authorization of COVID-19 convalescent plasma as adjuvant therapy for COVID-19 patient. So many health authorities in the world, including Indonesia, approved the convalescent plasma therapy for the COVID-19 patient. But it has to be given as part of the clinical trial to get the comprehensive and consistent data, which will be used to make COVID-19 management guidelines. Some clinical trials in Indonesia include the trial that conducted by Ministry of Research and Technology, by some hospital that Dr. Mo already talked before, and by the Research and Development Division of Ministry of Health, which is still ongoing. Convalescent plasma has to be collected according to technical instruction set by the government, and for PMI UDD also include the guidelines set by the PMI. Next slide. Based on Indonesian COVID-19 task force, the therapy of convalescent plasma is still in consideration as adjuvant therapy for severe and critical cases of COVID-19, but now also for moderate based on some study around the world. And next slide, please. But even though the clinical trial is still ongoing, due to the many testimonial events from the patient and the social media, and because there is still no definite therapy for COVID-19 patient, there is an increased demands of CCP. Hence, we have to increase the CCP supply. So PMI has to have CCP supply if the hospital asks to PMI. Next slide, please. And in May or June, the National Agency of Drug and Food Control published convalescent plasma preparation technical instruction. And around the same time, CBTS also published convalescent plasma preparation technical protocol for PMI UDD convalescent plasma. And we have a new revision in April 2021, the guide to provision of convalescent plasma for additional therapy for COVID-19 and PMI blood transfusion services. And also CBTS become coordinator of convalescent plasma, including for the Ministry of Health clinical trial. And our PMA chairman asked all PMI UDD to help in convalescent plasma supply. Next slide, please. Here, 3 steps of how we provide the CCP. First, recruitment that includes CCP donor register, donor selection. Second, CCP collection and processing that are done in PMI UDD. And third, CCP distribution from PMI UDD to the hospital. And Dr. Nova here with us as the head of Blood Services Division of CBTS will explain how PMI do collecting and processing of convalescent plasma. Dr. Nova, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ria. Okay. First, I would like to explain how we do the donor recruitment and selection. The recovered COVID-19 patients will fill in forms as part of the CCP donor registration. The recovered medium and severe COVID-19 patients can fill the forms through the hospital or through the IO donor website link or through the public domain. Next slide, please. The first screening will be done by, I think, the one before. Yeah, sorry. The first screening will be done by interviewing, and we will ask some of the requirement convalescent plasma donor. And the second screening include the test of COVID-19 antibody titer, CBC, TTI screening, antibody blood group serological screening, and if possible, do the antibody of HLA, HNA, and or HPA for female donors. Next slide, please. If the test pass, the plasma will be collected whether through the apheresis collection that will collect 400 to 600 milliliters, or through the conventional blood collection, and 450 milliliters of whole blood to get 200 milliliters of plasma. Next slide. CCP blood units have to assure the quality and safety of CCP. So the PMI UDD that provide convalescent plasma are the GMP certified PMI UDD, or the PMI UDD that is under provision of GMP certified PMI, or PMI UDD that is able to take responsibility of the CCP quality and safety. At the moment, there are 42 PMI UDD that provides CCP. Next slide, please. Here is the role of hospital and PMI UDD and COVID-19 convalescent plasma supply and demand. The doctor in hospital will be the one to decide whether the patient will need the convalescent plasma or not. Then the doctor will make a convalescent plasma request, contacting the PMI UDD and documenting the transfusion. Next slide. The CCP request to PMI UDD usually used by a blood request form that made by the doctor, in charge, and they also give the patient's blood sample to do the pre-transfusion test. Because we already do the blood group screening antibody, the most important thing is to ensure the compatibility of the blood type. Next slide. Next slide. The PMI UDD commitment is to supply the CCP for clinical trial, to supply CCP for therapy based on hospital or doctor's request, to prepare one set of ABO blood type CCP for health workers and clinical trials, to develop COVID-19 convalescent plasma donor bank data, to simplify and to speed up the CCP recruitment and selection process, and to educate the communities about CCP. Next slide. In early 2021, we have the support from the government, who made the declaration of convalescent plasma donor national movement. The event was held on January 18, 2021 by the Vice President of Indonesia, and the declaration was made about the participation in mobilizing the recovered COVID-19 patient to donate plasma. Next slide, please. But it's not easy to do the intersectoral coordination to distribute the CCP information and to ask the recovered COVID-19 patient to donate plasma. Actually, before the declaration, CBTS has sent some letters to the hospitals, hoping that we can get help in convalescent plasma donor recruitment. But next slide. But after the declaration, with the help of social media testimony, many hospitals and recovered patients asked about CCP supply and the procedure of CCP donation. Patients' family asked the CCP without the blood request from the doctor. PMI-UDD's duty to educate the communities about CCP supply and requests. And we also start involving the communities to do the CCP donor campaign. Next slide. And after that, the CCP demand is also increased. Hence, we need to make CCP donor bank data to simplify and to speed up the CCP recruitment and selection process. And following the MOH instruction, the PMI Board of Members sent letters to all PMI-UDD. CBTS also holds a CCP PMI-UDD coordination meeting to increase the CCP supply. At the moment, we also have the WhatsApp group that consists of all 42 PMI-UDD CCP provider that was asked to report the updated CCP data daily. Next slide. PMI-UDD also set convalescent plasma front desk in the hospitals and PMI-UDD where people can get information. The front desk is usually located in the front part of the hospital or near the customer service and provide QR scan code that will connect the plasma donor application to the application form. That also provide the hard copy of donor application form. And once again, it's not only in the hospital, but also in every PMI-UDD that provides CCP. Here is the flyer that distributed through the front desk. And in here, we can see the QR code that will be connected to the plasma donor application form. Next slide. In here, we can see some documentation of PMI-UDD's coordination with some institution and the government support in convalescent plasma, where we can see some ministers and head of local government gives plasma and inviting people to donate plasma. And in these photos, we can see the PMI-UDD do the CCP collection. And here are some communication, information, and social education media that we use to ask the recovered patient to donate plasma. And on May 17, PMI-UDD has provided 37,702 bags of convalescent plasma, and we still have to increase the supply because the demand is still higher than the supply. But according to the data, after the declaration, there are more than 300% increase of CCP distributed. And in April, there are times that PMI-UDD has more stock than the demands. And although the patient queue and stock available is changing all the time, the CCP daily need is around 200 blood bags per day. And the patient queue is usually fulfilled on the day after the CCP requested. And the CCP supply and distribution by regional and sub-regional system networks really helps in providing the supply of CCP in Indonesia. After this, I would like to invite Dr. Ria again to continue the presentation. Dr. Ria, the time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Nova. And this is the conclusion for our presentation that PMI-UDD duty and blood service include providing in the blood and blood component, also CCP, safe and quality supply. There is an increasing demand of CCP from the hospital, so PMI-UDD has to increase the CCP supply. PMI has a role in distributing information about requests and supply CCP to all the stakeholders. And after COVID-19 recovery, be a convalescent plasma donor. Convalescent plasma donor save the human fellow, save the nation. And we already done the summary of the points. Next slide. that Dr. Nova explained about the PMI UDD COVID-19 convalescent plasma. So I think this is I not read about it. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to end this presentation with this invitation to donate the plasma. Ayo donor plasma, plasma konvalesen, selamatkan sesama, selamatkan bangsa in Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ria and Dr. Nova. Thank you so very much. Let us move on to the next talk, which would be the last talk of the evening today. I am delighted to invite Professor Liise-Anne Pirofski. She is an MD from Albert Einstein College of Medicine and postdoctoral research fellowship from Albert Einstein College of Medicine again. She is a certified American Board of Internal Medicine and also subspecialty in infectious diseases. Currently working as professor of medicine, microbiology, and immunology at the same college. She has enormous number of publications, peer-reviewed journals, and books, chapters to her credit. Professor Pirofski, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm truly honored to participate and to share my experience with such distinguished people. So we're going to talk about randomized controlled trials for the next 20 minutes or so. And I want us to think about them from the perspective of the challenge that conducting them amid a pandemic poses. So we all know that randomized controlled trials are a very high form of science. The random assignment and the use of controls that occurs in this study design makes causal inferences possible and really facilitates statistical analysis. It minimizes selection bias, and importantly, at least early in the pandemic, for a scarce entity like convalescent plasma, it does provide a transparent allocation mechanism. Now, theoretically, random assignment balances the distribution of confounding variables and unknown and unaccounted for influences. But some of the things that we really need to think about are that a randomized controlled trial really depends upon prior knowledge for powering and sort of proper study design, that it requires also an infrastructure to make it happen, funding and coordination and time. And this actually can introduce some degree of bias if those things are all available in one place. The study design really cannot be adapted that easily to new knowledge, which is an issue when it's being gained weekly. As a result, some of these studies may end up being underpowered, and that is a problem for their interpretation. And then there are the ethical considerations of giving or not giving something that may perceive to cause a benefit. So what I really want to do is to kind of, what I say is go behind the headlines. These randomized controlled trials, and we're going to be reviewing the main published trials, have generated a lot of headlines and a lot of discussion, most of which has been negative. So I want to take a step back and look behind the headlines, not so much at the primary outcomes of these studies, but the other incredible information that these very energetic and brave scientists have really provided us with. So we're going to start with the first study that came from China. It was a multi-center study that was conducted very early in the pandemic from February to April of 2020. It was a randomized open label study with standard of care with a one-to-one randomization. And the primary outcome was a composite. And this is pretty popular in randomized controlled trials. The bottom line was that there was no difference between the groups for the primary outcome. But the subgroup analyses in this study were very interesting. So as was alluded to all morning, night, there is a difference between patients that are mild, moderate, severely, and extremely ill. This study enrolled patients that were what they called severely ill, who had an oxygen saturation of less than 93, and then patients that had life-threatening disease who were basically mechanically ventilated and in shock. And you can see in the panel there that the outcome in the patients that had severe disease was good. The patients with plasma did better. And another outcome in this study was, and again, as has pointed out with the power of plasma as an antiviral agent, is that there was very rapid clearance of virus in this study. Now, some of the caveats that we should think about, and I'm going to go through all these in the same way. The patients were older, and many of them were treated weeks after the onset of their disease. And something we need to think about as we go forth is what we mean by symptom duration, what we mean by disease severity. So these patients were treated weeks after being in the hospital. Many of them, the plasma that was used might be characterized best as mixed. One of the problems, as has been pointed out, is the harmonization in the plasma that's used. But I would say that there was probably a range. This was a bit pragmatic in the plasma use. And many of the patients were on steroids. And as I just alluded to, as a problem with randomized controlled trials, this study was terminated early because the pandemic waned where it was being done, and it was underpowered. The next study comes from India, was conducted between April and July of 2020. Similar study design with the exception of 2 units being given. A point here is that the plasma was studied retrospectively for antibodies, and it actually turned out that only about 30% of these patients that 30% of the units that were given did not have neutralizing activity. Again, the composite primary outcome was not met, but in the subgroups, again, patients felt better symptomatically. There was evidence of viral clearance. And in the caveat section, again, patients were treated after 8 days of symptoms. As I mentioned, 30% of the patients did not receive neutralizing antibodies. But something important to come from this is that neutralizing antibodies were present in the patients at baseline and in over 80% of the patients. Again, in this study, many of the patients, most of the patients were on steroids. If we move forth a little bit in the pandemic, here we have a study from Argentina that went from May until August. This study design included a real comparator, placebo, which was saline. In addition, in this study, the plasma was pre-vetted in a pretty good way. And the patients, I think we can feel comfortable, received what we would call high titer plasma. The primary endpoint was clinical status on an ordinal scale. Again, no difference. But in the subgroup, some additional interesting observations. So in the plasma group, the group that plasma was favored in this study were patients that were over the age of 65 and not on steroids. Interestingly, the placebo was favored in younger patients, less than 65, and patients that had a longer symptom duration, patients that were female, and also seropositive. And the interesting thing about the seropositivity in this particular study was that more of the younger patients, the less than 65, were seropositive, and they also had higher titers. Again, the time to symptoms to enrollment was over a week. And another point here, which is maybe bad luck or the luck of the draw, is that the groups were really not well balanced despite randomization. The plasma group was sicker. More of them were on non-invasive ventilation. They were in the ICU. Their inflammatory markers were higher, and more were seropositive at baseline. Again, corticosteroid use very high, over 90% in both groups. So now we come to the Lipster study, which you've heard about in multiple talks. And what I'm going to say about this is that it really provides our grounding, our proof of principle. A couple of notable things are that these patients were elderly, they were over the age of 75, they were outpatients, they were randomized to a true placebo, which was saline. They were treated within 3 days of illness. As Dr. Joyner pointed out, there was a significant reduction in progression of disease in the patients who received plasma that was even greater for a higher titer, and also was greater for patients that had an even shorter symptom onset. So this is amazing. This is great. I will say that the workflow and infrastructure that was needed for this was an amazing tour de force. These patients had to be treated, tested, and then treated, and it is a model. But it is, I believe, a challenge in many places that are dealing with a raging pandemic. Nonetheless, as Dr. Casadevall pointed out, this provided proof of principle for early administration of plasma and really paved the way for a lot of the validation that we saw with monoclonal antibodies. So back to the hospitalized patients, because really we want to know whether this stuff works for patients who are in the hospital, where we have very limited options. So here's an encouraging study that was done in New York City and Brazil. It was done between April and November of 2020. The study design was a 2-to-1 randomization scheme that gave 1 unit of plasma versus standard plasma, or FFP. The plasma was vetted by the New York Blood Center for having neutralizing antibodies. It was probably mostly high titer. The primary endpoint was clinical status at day 28, and that endpoint was not met. However, in the subgroup analysis, which was pre-specified in this study, there was a remarkable mortality benefit in the patients who got plasma, a marked reduction in mortality. And in the subgroups, as I think we are all getting used to hearing right now, plasma was favored in the patients that had higher titer antibody. And in this study, interestingly, patients who were receiving steroids. A couple of other things, these patients were enrolled quite late, 10 days into their course of symptoms. About, interestingly to me, because I'm interested in age, maybe because I'm old, that almost 50% of the patients that received plasma were less than the age of 60. There were a high number of patients that had mechanical ventilation in this study, and there was steroid use, but not as rampant as in some of the other studies. So now we come to recovery, where there's really a lot to unpack. And you know, with all that has been discussed about this study, I want to thank these people for doing this, because it is really a gold mine. I believe we will be looking back into this data and using it to go forth for many, many years. So this study was conducted in the United Kingdom. Interestingly and importantly, it really spanned a couple of different eras of the pandemic. It began in May of 2020 and it came into 2021. The study design was to standard of care. Most patients received 2 units. The plasma was pre-vetted on the Euroimmune platform, and I think that and that is an acceptable platform for vetting the plasma, at least according to the US FDA. This had mortality as the outcome, and it was identical in both groups. Now, the subgroup analyses could consume 2 hours of discussion, but I want to point out a couple of important things. That plasma was favored for a mortality reduction in some important groups. Patients that were not on oxygen, patients that were treated within 7 days, patients that were not on corticosteroids, and patients that were seronegative at baseline. And plasma was also favored for discharge alive, very strongly for patients that were seronegative at baseline, but also patients that were not on oxygen and not on corticosteroids. The median symptom duration in these patients, again, was a little on the longer side, but luckily, this trial enrolled patients that were not on oxygen. So it's 8%, but it was 900 patients, which is larger than any other study so far. And another important thing is that about 30% or more of this entire cohort was seronegative at the time of enrollment. Very, very high steroid use in this trial. And importantly, the variant, the so-called UK variant, arose during the winter of this study. and may in part explain why there is a difference in plasma and placebo being favored less towards plasma after December of 2020. We don't know. So to summarize all these studies, there are hints of what may be going on, but there are absolutely no rules that have emerged from the data so far. So I've sort of colored this by the era of the pandemic. So the first, basically by the US, winter to spring, and then the summer, and then the recovery trial, which kind of went across these eras. And only one of these studies met its primary endpoint, that is the outpatient Libster study. None of the rest of them did, but we kind of get a picture of a number of important things. The antiviral effect of convalescent plasma in the two first studies, the potentially negative effect of corticosteroid therapy in many of these studies, a possible effect of age, and very important ideas that have to do with seronegativity at the time of enrollment, which may be an indicator of patients who are less ill. So why, Arturo used the form mixed effects. I think that's a great term. So why is this happening? Can we really expect an all-comer trial with this many patients to give us a single signal? Maybe not, but let's go over a couple of things. I think we can agree that most patients in these studies did not have early disease. The symptom duration exceeded a week in most trials. I don't want to harp on symptom duration, but as these studies began, it really was the only indicator with what was known about the disease. And I think that the error, if there was one, is not distinguishing between symptom duration or onset of illness with severity of illness. Many of these patients had severe disease, were in potentially this inflammatory phase that you just heard a great talk about. And in studies that looked half to more of the patients were seropositive, again, indicating that they had their own response and probably did not have early disease, since it takes about a week for the IgG response to develop. Now, these inconsistent findings with these different endpoints, antiviral, mortality, clinical ordinal scales, the clinical scales, whether we like it or not, provide a lot more information. And when they provide a lot more information, they are not providing a binary outcome, and they're going to have a lot more noise. And that noise is probably due to the product, the fact that plasma still remains quite a mystery to us, and also because the full picture of the patients who might benefit really has not emerged. Now, there are a number of unforeseen factors, as I reviewed in the this is supposed to be fixed by randomization, but here they are, time. So the standard of care really varied and changed and improved, honestly, over time, in real time, as these studies were being rolled out. There are heterogeneous treatment effects, I think, most likely, due to the use of corticosteroids and other medications, and these also are not independent variables because they change with time. And then we have the patient heterogeneity, whether we really understand the risk factors that are affecting severity and course. And then, of course, we have the plasma. We've done a lot of work with neutralization, but as Dr. Casadevall pointed out, there are other activities in plasma. There are other isotypes in plasma other than IgG, and these really have not received much attention. And then, of course, we have the virus. We've had the emergence of variants, and the other issue of whether plasma needs to be local, whether there are subspecies of viruses in different communities or areas, is a potential question in our minds. Many of these trials used a centralized plasma source rather than local plasma. So I'd like to turn for a minute to tell you a little bit about the work that we've done in the Bronx with convalescent plasma. So the Bronx is a borough of New York City. It has 1.4 million people. It is a very ethnically and racially diverse borough, very few Caucasians. And about 30% of the people live below the poverty line. In the last census, not this one, but the one before, it was the poorest urban congressional district in the United States. It had the highest rates of COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths in New York City. As we were overwhelmed with our first patients that began arriving in March of 2020, a number of us decided that we would like to deploy plasma. I'd worked on antibody for 30 years. And we devised an ELISA to test antibodies and a pseudo-neutralization assay, and we were able to recruit our incredibly grateful survivors of COVID-19 to provide plasma. And we conducted a study just over a couple of weeks using the Expanded Access Program protocol, where we gave plasma from our donors to patients in our hospital. We were amid a terrible surge. These patients were treated by day 3, but they were extremely ill. We treated 103 patients and went into our EMR to look for controls. And we found the following thing on day 28 when we looked at mortality. You can see it was unbelievably high. There was not a statistically significant difference between the patients that got plasma and those that didn't. But because we noted a signal potentially in younger patients, we looked at that subgroup and we found a marked reduction in mortality in younger patients. Now, of course, age is the most important prognostic factor for mortality in COVID-19, and this was statistically significant. But we were bothered by the fact that our results, quite frankly, were very different than the other open label studies, the ones that Dr. Casadevall referred to from Houston Methodist and from Mount Sinai, even though we treated our patients very early. And so we decided to conduct a randomized controlled trial. This trial was written in March of 2020. It was launched on April 17th of 2020. It began on a wing and a prayer with NYU Langone and Einstein, with our hospitals basically looking the other way and helping us by ignoring us. And we deployed this trial where we enrolled patients who were PCR positive within 7 days of symptoms, and who had an oxygen requirement that was not mechanical ventilation. The comparator was saline. The primary outcome is the WHO 11-point scale clinical status at day 14, the secondary the same at day 28. We did write in a number of pre-specified exploratory outcomes having to do with mortality and titer, as well as baseline antibody status, concomitant medications like steroids and remdesivir. The pandemic quarter and the site, because what happened was that, like our colleagues in China, mercifully, our surge ended. We ran out of patients to enroll. And at that time, the NIH became interested in our trial and helped us with significant funding to expand to other sites that you see listed there. And the trial ran then until March 29th of 2021, enrolled 941 patients, and we're very anxious to be able to understand the results and make them public soon. At the time that this was going on during the summer, when we really worried that we would not be able to get an answer because of the shifting sites of the pandemic, I participated in the development of a international pooling project called Compile. This project basically was sort of a real-time meta-analysis where patient-level data was provided from ongoing and recently completed randomized controlled trials to a DSMB that looked at it every 2 weeks. There were different controls, which you see listed here, this same outcomes as contain, and just listed there on the right was an extremely sophisticated way of de-identifying data and managing this database. This study ended up enrolling 2,400 patients and is also in the process of being understood. So I want to close by reminding us all, as I think was beautifully pointed out, in all of the talks, that the goal of therapy with convalescent plasma is to contain the virus before the host damage ensues. And if you can look at this parabola here and look at that presenting disease part, forget about how long it is. What our real goal is to help the people get below that dotted line, which is where damage starts, and to either hope they do that on their own, and we still don't have good signals of who that is, and that's where our plasma needs to work before patients have developed their own immune response, most likely, and to prevent that upward arrow that leads to this devastation. And I think one of the reasons that many of us who have encountered pushback from our peers on this have really hung on to it is that anybody who is taking care of patients with COVID-19 in the hospital knows that it's a devastating disease, and that any thing that we have that may save lives, we really need to make a better effort to try and understand, because there really isn't anything else on the horizon. So where have we been and where are we going? I think it's pretty clear that plasma has shown hints of benefit. We all hedge our words with this in subgroups of patients that are hospitalized. It's okay, we don't have the answer, but we really need to study these subgroups better and get an understanding of what went on. The other thing we really don't know yet is what the optimal characteristics of effective plasma are. I'll give you that if it's really high titer, that may be great, but we don't know where the floor is, and we don't really know what the ceiling is, and we don't know what the other aspects of plasma that may be beneficial or even possibly not beneficial are. Now, the negative results of these trials are important. And I think it's fair to say that they probably reflect unanticipated heterogeneous treatment effects or other effects that occurred during the time of the pandemic, like concurrent medications, the passage of time, the arrival of viral variants. We need to understand this better. And then this whole thing about early treatment. What is early? One person's early is another person's late. We need better ways of focusing on disease and enrolling patients and giving this to patients who have early disease. So that means, I think, no oxygen or a minimal oxygen requirement, and possibly patients that are seronegative. Now, the results of several large trials should be coming out soon, and I'm really encouraged to hear about your great results there. And I just want to say that this disease is really scary. We've all been through a lot, but as Marie Curie said here, now is the time to really understand more so that we may fear less. And I really am hopeful that in this second plus year of the pandemic, that we will get a better understanding of the science, and it will help us deploy this incredibly, I think, potentially life-saving medication better. So there's always gratitude. And I just want to acknowledge, all the people that I work with, including the National Plasma Leadership Group, the leadership of these trials. I just want to say, if there are any young women or young scientists out there, these are two young physician scientists who didn't know from clinical trials or anything when this started, and the whole enterprise has been on their shoulders, and I'm really proud of them. And then, of course, our funding. We would not be able to do this. And I do want to mention the Mathers Foundation. Many of you may never have heard of it. It is a foundation in New York City that took a risk on funding this trial early on when it was difficult to get other resources, and I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Pirofski. Thank you for a great talk. And let's move on to the Q&A session for today, and we have several questions which are thought-provoking. So let me start with Professor Joyner. So there is a question which says that the dose and concentration of antibodies inside convalescent plasma would be crucial for measurement of the endpoints, that is mortality, viral clearance, and recovery, etc. Do you think that we have to be careful in interpreting those studies, and are they all within a therapeutic range? And if translated to animal models, can they be supraphysiological?
Yeah. I think you have to look at the animal models as proof of principle, proof of concept. I think you also have to look at it in what I've described as a replacement therapy. The patients who don't make antibodies, there's a large number, probably over 100 cases in the literature in 2s, 3s, up to 15 or 20 of patients on rituximab who don't have a lot of B cells that seem to respond very well when they're given convalescent plasma. Many of these people have this smoldering form of COVID. They don't get into the hyperinflammatory state, as Dr. Pirofski mentioned, because they can't generate the inflammatory storm without the antibodies. So many of these people seem to do pretty well. You hear these reports of people who've had kind of these smoldering symptoms, fevers on, off. They get a little bit better with remdesivir. This happens, that happens. But then somebody after 2 months, somebody gives them, a bag of plasma every day for a couple of days or 3 or 4 days, and they leave the hospital. So I think you have to be careful to extrapolate that too much, other than to say it's proof of principle like the animal studies are. And then I think, what do we have here? Just like there's been issues with diagnostic testing, this is not a stable disease that we completely understand the pathophysiology of. And that's why I use the example of trials in lipid lowering and heart disease. If this was lipid lowering and heart disease, you know how to design the trial, you know what the endpoints are. It takes, 3 or 4 years to accrue all the patients and so forth. But this is very fast moving. You have a lot of additional treatments that have come on. There's a lot of discussion among our group, Dr. Pirofski, Dr. Casadevall, myself, and others, about whether people are getting treated with steroids too early. It's a clear benefit for late treatment, but too early. So I just think that there's just so many nuances, so many nooks and crannies, so many elements of this that are hard to factor out, that we're not going to have a clear picture of what worked under what circumstances for a couple of years. And I think we can say there's pretty good evidence in early treatment, pretty good evidence in people that don't make antibodies, less good evidence in sort of full-blown salvage therapy in somebody who's mechanically ventilated or on ECMO and been in the ICU for weeks. Then I think everything else in between is just full of just a very difficult kind of clinical ecosystem to parse out and understand.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Let's move on to, before I move on, let me also introduce Professor Eri from Indonesian Pretermaternal Association. He will also have a question for our panelists today. So maybe later I'll request him to ask his question. But I'll move on to Professor Casadevall. So we all agree, and you alluded in your talk about specificity, quantity, and temporal effects. So the question is around that only, and early detection, early hospitalization, availability of convalescent plasma are real challenges. And what is the best time to start treatment of convalescent plasma, and till what end can we delay the treatment to get an acceptable benefit of convalescent plasma? And also the quantity of antibodies, neutralizing antibodies, which should be minimum given to the patients.
Best time to, the data are that the earlier you give it after symptoms begin, the more likely you are to get a benefit. And in this case, for example, in the Lipster trial, it was given within 3 days of symptoms. I think that that we don't know when is the latest that you can give it, but we do know that the earliest is better. As to the amount, again, it's variable, but I think having some, you need to have antibody there for sure, and you need to have, and ideally you should have a high titer neutralizing antibody, because that's the one that we are measuring most commonly. My views on plasma are simple. You have a lot of data suggesting efficacy. You have the positive results are difficult to ignore. The negative results can be explained. And it's not like you have many alternatives available. In fact, and what what I would say is plasma is relatively safe. It is not adriamycin. It is not amphotericin B. It seems to me that one would err on the side of using it in this situation.
I think to amplify what Dr. Casadevall said, I think we all think about diagnostic testing, but I think one of the things that is going to happen is people are going to say, well, there was a signal of efficacy. What do we do to be prepared for the next time? Or I think folks in the blood banking and transfusion medicine community are going to say, there may be other niche diseases that this could be used in more routinely. And I think we're going to have to work on characterizing what is in the convalescent plasma, more thoroughly. And the challenge here is people in a high throughput blood bank need simple machines that give you, high, medium, low. Whereas the sorts of things that Arturo and Liise-anne have talked about, IgA, IgM, antibodies dependent in cellular cytotoxicity and so forth, these are assays that are quite complicated and I don't think currently can be run at scale. So I do think we need some R&D to think about how we characterize the antiviral effects or antimicrobial effects of convalescent plasma going forward, and really have that better organized for any ongoing use and any future kind of pandemics.
And I would add to that, though, that you could make the argument from the many successful studies that have been done that high titer defined by the US FDA or whatever is probably sufficient. I mean, I would be comfortable when the next pandemic comes, taking people who had recovered and finding the highest titer plasma and giving it. I think that one of the things that interests me about this disease is that the steroid use is really rampant and it's excessive and it's being used outside the guidelines of recovery. I mean, I find it ironic, actually, that recovery did not find efficacy in many of the patients who are receiving steroids, especially in the United States. And now we're hearing from India about fungal diseases occurring in patients. And so, I actually think that convalescent plasma has the potential to be a better anti-inflammatory agent than steroids. But we've got to work on it to find those activities. I mean, there's a hint of it in a study on the preprint server from Ray et al. In India. I don't know what's happened to the study. It hasn't been published yet. But, I think that there's good reason to believe that it would be possible with some work to harness the anti-inflammatory activity, that thing that makes the patients feel better. That was a classic description of patients that received convalescent whatever in the pre-antibiotic era. They almost immediately felt better. And I think many of us have seen this from patients, even very ill patients. So, I think that we can divide what the necessity is in an emergency. I think that harnessing these neutralizing antibodies, that's good, but I would not give up on the anti-inflammatory effects to give a more specific therapy to temper the inflammation. And, for those of you who are interested, although I was running a trial in patients who required oxygen, as the data began to accumulate, because we couldn't change the trial, we at Montefiore give patients plasma using the emergency use authorization who are not on oxygen. And that's been our practice now through the infectious disease division for a while. It's pragmatic information. We'll have more data soon. And just one other thing, I saw a question in the chat. We've used convalescent plasma in patients with pregnancy. We don't use it any differently in those patients. It's been safe. Actually, during Ebola, convalescent plasma was used in pregnant women, and I actually think it may be much better for them potentially than remdesivir. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pirofski. A follow-up question to this would be, are there any contraindications or adverse effects of convalescent plasma? And this has been a question widely discussed and also asked by a lot of participants. So maybe Professor Pirofski, you want to take that, and then we can do a quick roundtable on that, on the experiences.
Well, I would say that available data has not demonstrated harm. The safety is, I think, pretty well established, especially by the expanded access program. So many patients got plasma that its safety is the same as non-convalescent plasma. Of course, as our transfusion colleague pointed out, it needs to be collected properly. It needs to be safe from the point of view of the plasma being safe. I cannot say that there are not signals in certain patients who may do worse if they get plasma, but there really is not data that has emerged like that. I think that the antibody-dependent enhancement argument has pretty much been put to rest. Whoever was voicing it got tired or saw the data. So it's very, very hard to know. I think it gets at Dr. Casadevall's point that he may want to amplify on. The amount of actual antibody in plasma is really low. And then it has to find its target. And then if you're asking it to also, explode the immune system, I would be much worried, more worried about that with hyperimmune globulin or other preparations that contain much more antibody.
Thank you. Professor Joyner, any comments to it?
So when we started, there was a lot of concern about TACO and TRALI, transfusion-associated cardiac overload, transfusion-related acute lung injury. And we've looked, most recently, we looked at 5,000 patients, 20,000 patients. We've now looked at all 95,000 patients that we have and are sending final reports to various, safety monitoring organizations. And the number of transfusion-related issues we had are less than 100. So that's less than 1 in 1,000. And I think only about maybe 60 of those are either probably or possibly or probably related, or probably or definitely related. And I think the folks we all criticize or point out some of the issues or nuances with recovery, but their safety data was roughly in the same ballpark. And in these large trials, you're not seeing a lot. Now that's difficult sometimes because the patients are in the ICU. So how do you know if giving plasma made their respiratory status worse or better and so forth? But I think with modern blood banking, modern screening, excluding certain donors and so forth, I think you can get really good results, very safe results. And one thing Arturo said in a conversation earlier is, remember, a lot of times when we think about transfusion reactions, we're thinking about massive transfusions, people on a liver transplant getting 10, 15, 20 units, trauma patient, whatever. But we're talking, 1 or 2 units, maybe, even if it's over a few days. This is not, massive transfusion territory.
Yeah, I would like to reinforce that the safety profile is extremely good, and you have considerable evidence of efficacy. I think that the people who are not using it really need to consider that.
Right. Thank you, Professor Casadevall. So let me move on to Dr. Monica. Dr. Monica, there is a question on recovery trial, and although the titers were higher, but the trial did not yield a lot of results for convalescent plasma. So, can I have your take on that?
Well, hello. Okay. Well, the recovery trial is really something here in Indonesia because, I will take the slide on it. please. Okay. I would like to thank you for all the participants of recovery trial, because this is a study with a very huge participant, and we can learn a lot, a lot from this study. First, it said that the neutralizing titers are 1 and 100 or more in convalescent plasma. As you can see, there is 3 important factors: dose, antibody level, and timing. And in our country, the Indonesian Red Cross use a minimal is 160, and we also use 320. So there is a little bit difference here. Based on this data, we must think not to stop it, but think how if we use more or a higher titer, because we must think about in the neutralizing titer is 100. How can we use if we use more titer? Not to stop it, but to improve the study design. Second, hospitalized patients of any age were eligible for the trial if they had clinically suspected or laboratory confirmed. As we use here, we always give the plasma to the laboratory confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection, not to clinically suspected, because the swab PCR is still the golden standard. So from this data, we can learn that we must homogenize all of the participants. Next. Nearly all participants receive plasma from 2 different donors to increase the chance that at least one contained higher concentration of neutralizing antibody. So based on this fact, we have to learn that we must validate the antibody level. Next. However, recovery trial only included patients admitted to hospital. Therefore, the trial doesn't address whether convalescent plasma has any benefit if given early after SARS-CoV-2 infection and before the onset of significant disease. So based on this information, we can learn that we can give the plasma earlier with the validated antibody titer or antibody level, and we have to regard how many days the patient already suffered the disease before he or she admit to the hospital, because it will affect the result of the trial. So based on the information, we can improve the future study design. It's very, 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 is give a very, very, is very benefit for us. Okay, and next. The presence of anti-SARS-CoV antibodies in recipient at the time of transfusion with convalescent plasma has also been cited as a possible reason for the absence of an observed effect. In this trial, we found that 38% of patients were seronegative at randomization, and at randomization, 38% of patients were seronegative. So it means, in other words, they have no antibody to SARS-CoV-2. So how about the rest or the remainder? Because 38%, so the rest is 62%. So based on the information, we can learn that we also have to calculate, have to detect, have to observe that the patient, which is the patient who has antibody and which is the patient who has not antibody. So, and in this trial, we can also learn that we must separate it, moderate states, severe state, and critical state. And based on the valid data that suggests that we give in early state, so we can make a study design that compare the Sp.PD or convalescent plasma treatment in early state. So based on this trial, we learn a lot. We can make a better study design from this trial. And the next question is, how about the research of convalescent plasma in Indonesia? Well, I already explained it before this, and when I speak about there is a clinical trial of therapeutic plasma convalescent in COVID-19 patient in Saiful Anwar General Hospital. And I thank you, Dr. Putu, for this trial because he leads this trial, and the trial is still going on because the trial gave a very good and promising result in severe and critical patient. The trial also expanded to moderate level state of the disease. And how about multi-center trial? Yes, it is. Indonesia have multi-center trial from 10 hospitals in Indonesia. And the interim analysis not published yet, that for the data that we have, the Sp.PD significantly decreased mortality rate in moderate and severe state of the disease. And other trial, also in other hospital, Maranatha Christian University and Primaya Hospital, and Maya Pada Jakarta, and Mandara Bali, all of those trials found that the higher the titer, the better the result. The earlier we give the Sp.PD, the better the result. So that's all. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. We are just over the time, but I'll take the last question for today for Dr. Ria, and then I'll hand over to Professor Eri if he has any question for the panelists. So, Dr. Ria, the question is, how long do you store convalescent plasma in the inventory?
Okay, thank you. Thank you in the question. Actually, we already answered the question in the WhatsApp. This is the answer. We don't dispose the CCP because usually the demand of convalescent plasma is higher than the supply, so we don't dispose the CCP.
Thank
that
you.
is Dr. Anum.
Yeah, and Professor Eri, do you have any question for the panelists?
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for giving me some chance. Maybe I can use this only a few minutes since we know that the time is limited. My directions to, I'm attracted to Professor Pirofski, the last speaker. There is her presentation I just appreciate. That is a very clear, all multi-center result showed that indicated by giving plasma therapy, it look here at the severe type. That is, but according to my yes, my understanding here, there is still a confusion as the clinicians where the facilitate, for instance, how to support the data, which when exactly the treatment should be started, that is we need here. For instance, if at clinical performance, just very clear, close to cytokine storm, right? So it should be logically, the support of antibody administrations should be given sooner here. But what we need now is Is there any, Professor Pirofski, the study showing the after assessments, for instance, by IL-1 or IL-6 had already been provided and indicate, yes, that is the PCT should be started sooner. We just remember that PCT is just only the adjuvant, is never stand alone. Thank you to the last speaker, Professor Pirofski.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I'm not aware. Actually, the early studies, both the open label and the randomized controlled trial from China, showed reductions in inflammatory markers, including IL-6, most notably IL-6, as well as C-reactive protein in patients who received plasma. I suspect that may be a separate activity than the activity that's antiviral, but I don't know for sure. I think that if everybody takes a step back, that there is a very good time to give plasma, and that would be before the other drugs are indicated. Right now, we're using a lot of remdesivir here in the United States, and we're also using a lot of steroids, but they're really indicated in patients that have oxygen requirements and increasing oxygen requirements. Therefore, I think that with a little bit of assembly of some of this massive data, that the best thing to do is give people plasma when they come through the door. And actually, we've been trying to convince our emergency department to hold off on starting steroids, because they do the regular thing, like, happens a lot in infectious disease. You put the drug on and then, you wait a little bit and determine whether you're going to continue it. And we've been trying to get them to hold off to give plasma, and then we can assess after that whether the patient is a candidate for steroids or not. But I believe that there is a place. I will add that part of Compile, which I mentioned in my talk, it has been the application of a machine learning model to come up with a treatment benefit index. And I've seen it, and it's pretty compelling. And it really uses the patient characteristics that are available at baseline. It does not include antibody, by the way. But it includes other characteristics, which actually you might find surprising. And what I will say to those of you conducting your RCTs or your trials is that the Compile group is very interested in obtaining information to validate their model. In fact, they're doing so with the US FDA, I believe, next week. We gave them our open label data to help them. And I think that this would be very powerful. It's a very well-built model, and if you're interested in contributing data, it's de-identified data, just let me know and I'll put you in touch with them. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And any last comment, Professor Joyner and Professor Casadevall, before I hand over?
Nothing here.
Thank you. Nothing. Thanks a lot. Anything, Dr. Monica, Dr. Ria as well? Any last comments, quick ones?
One last comment from us is we would love to see, the slides weren't totally clear of your preliminary data from your outstanding trials that you shared, so we couldn't see the actual granular level of the results. So we'd love to see the actual table a little bit more clearly. For the bottom line stuff was great, but we'd love to see the interim analysis whenever you can share that with us.
Okay, I will send you.
I would also urge you to please, when you have your paper ready, put it as a preprint.
Yeah.
We are aware of a lot of papers in which the authors have not wanted to put it as a preprint, that the information is not out 6 or 8 months later. And today, for example, Recovery was first a press release, then it was a preprint, and we have been able to have that information since February.
Yes, Prof. I will share it to you.
Thank you so much.
As soon as I have it.
Thank you to all.
Very
the
welcome.
Let me hand over back to my colleague Liise-anne for the closing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anupam, for facilitating the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost reached the end of our insightful and interesting discussion. Let me thanking once again to all panelists and moderator, Professor Arturo, Professor Joyner, Professor Pirofski, Dr. Mo, Dr. Ria, and Dr. Anupam. Before we finish, I would like to give some information. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We also received a follow-up email with a link to view recording of today's webinar. We have special performance of Anesthesiology and Intensive Care Department Faculty of Medicine, Pajajaran University. Hope you can enjoy it. Before we close today's webinar, I would like to share with a quote from Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher. The secret of change is to focus all your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new. Hopefully, the presentation will be beneficial for everybody, especially to deliver of essential health services for COVID-19 patients. Thank you everyone for attending today's international webinar, Convalescent Plasma Therapy. On behalf of Indonesian Medical Council, Maranatha Christian University, Terumo Indonesia, Itama Ranoraya, and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Before I'm Dian signing off, I would like to invite Dr. Mo, as initiator of today's webinar, to express her gratitude for all that have supported this event. Dr. Mo, the time is yours.
Thank you for all those supported this international webinar, Faculty of Medicine, Maranatha Christian University. From speaker, honorary invitation, participant, and companies that all made this webinar very successful. I also would like to say thank you very much, especially for Professor Michael J. Joyner, Mayo Clinic, Professor Arturo Casadevall, Johns Hopkins, and Professor Pirofski, Albert Einstein College of Medicine. All of you have a very powerful presentation. We are really grateful that you share your valuable experiences with us here in Indonesia. Before I say goodbye, I would like to quote my principle of life. Be a grain of rice that can change the scale. No matter how small the good that you do, it is of great value for science and humanity. Love you all. Dogmo.
Special message for Indonesian Red Cross. As long as I bring the Sp.PD from the first time to present, I meet many, in this case unlimited, people who support me and build a special connection beyond work. One of them is people from Indonesian Red Cross. Long before I meet those special people, I already communicated with Dr. Budi Darmawan from Rembang. He already passed away in January 2021. My respect for him. I will always remember when I met Dr. Nunuk from Indonesian Red Cross Sidoarjo. Then Dr. Linda and Dr. Ria from Indonesian Red Cross Jakarta. Dr. Suwanta from Indonesian Red Cross Cirebon. Dr. Uke from Indonesian Red Cross Bandung, and other Indonesian Red Cross staffs. When we talk, I feel like I find a family here. We have the same principle, will, and dream. And yes, they are a family for me. I honor them for their courage, pure heart, and dedication to provide convalescent plasma for everyone in all the regions of Indonesia. Thank you, Indonesian Red Cross, for teaching me the valuable lesson. Appreciation of life is unconditional love. Love you all.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Di masa pandemi COVID-19, banyak dari kita yang mengalami stres, ya. Kemudian merasa jenuh, bosan karena tidak bisa kemana-mana berjalan-jalan dan lain sebagainya. Tapi saya sangat salut dengan timnya Dr. Dodi dan kawan-kawan dari Departemen Anestesi mampu mengatasi semua ini dengan enjoy, bermain musik, nyanyi-nyanyi, dan lain sebagainya. Sehingga apa? Antibodi yang tumbuh akibat bermain musik itu akan menghalau apa yang dinamakan COVID-19. Bravo anestesi, bravo Dr. Dodi dan kawan-kawan. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Nina Susana Dewi, Direktur Utama Rumah Sakit Hasan Sadikin Bandung. Dalam situasi yang baik ini, saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada KSM Departemen Anestesi Rumah Sakit Hasan Sadikin yang telah berhasil membuat suatu karya seni untuk berbagi, menyemangati dalam kehangatan dan kegembiraan bagi masyarakat, juga bagi petugas-petugas kesehatan. Walaupun dalam situasi pandemi yang menyebabkan kita harus bekerja secara extraordinary dan dituntut output dalam menurunkan angka kesakitan dan menurunkan kematian. Saya tunggu karya-karya lainnya, dan aku bangga menjadi warga RSHS. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Om Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, dan selamat malam untuk semuanya. Saya Dodi Tavianto, Kepala Departemen KSM Anestesiologi dan Terapi Intensif Fakultas Kedokteran Universitas Pajajaran RSUP Dr. Hasan Sadikin. Pada kesempatan malam ini ingin menyampaikan apresiasi yang setinggi-tingginya kepada seluruh PPDS saya, PPDS Anestesiologi FK 4 yang telah berhasil membuat suatu karya seni berupa konser virtual yang ditayangkan lewat kanal YouTube yang sedang, sudah, dan akan kita saksikan pada malam hari ini. Seperti kita ketahui bahwa pandemi COVID ini mengubah segala-galanya, segala aspek kehidupan, termasuk juga kehidupan para PPDS saya di dalam rumah sakit. Penerapan protokol kesehatan yang mau tidak mau harus dilakukan sedikit banyak memberikan efek tekanan mental kepada para PPDS. Akhir kata, sekali lagi terima kasih PPDS, teruslah berkarya, dan saya menunggu kreativitas kalian selanjutnya. Selamat menikmati.
When troubles come and my heart burdens me, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stay on mountain. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulder. You raise me up to more than I can be. When troubles come and my heart burdens me, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stay on mountain. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulder. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up